Oh, wait, so get this. It's January 14th, 2025, and we are diving into a whole bunch of news from India and around the world. It's like a little time capsule from today.
Yeah.
You know, we've got the Hindu Times of India. We've even got the Economic Times and Mint. So we're really getting the full picture.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty fascinating mix. What kind of headlines caught your eye?
Well, one that really jumped out at me was this plane crash in Kazakhstan.
Oh, wow.
It's not just the crash itself, but the political fallout and what it might mean for aviation safety internationally.
Hmm.
And then closer to home, there's this controversy over rat hole coal mining in Meghalaya.
Oh, right.
It's dangerous. It's been banned. But it seems like it's still happening.
Yeah, that's definitely concerning. I mean, it's a complicated situation for sure.
Oh, and get this. There's even a story about a new fungus species.
Mm,
And dermatologists are all in a tizzy about it because of its name.
really? That's interesting.
I know, right?
Mm.
Who knew fungi could be so controversial?
It's amazing how these seemingly unrelated events can be connected in really unexpected ways.
Exactly. So are you ready to unpack this news time capsule from January 14th, 2025?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
All right, let's start with some good news from India.
Okay.
Prime Minister Modi just inaugurated this Zimor tunnel in Jammu and Kashmir.
Yeah, I was just reading about that. That tunnel is a major infrastructure project connecting Kashmir with Ladakh. And they're saying it could really boost tourism and make things easier for people living there, especially in the winter when the snow makes travel so difficult.
Yeah, no more treacherous mountain roads.
Right.
And speaking of challenges, we have that stark contrast with the story about rat hole coal mining in Meghalaya.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly dangerous. And there was this accident recently where several miners got trapped.
Oh, gosh.
And all the sources are highlighting this debate about whether the government's really doing enough to enforce the ban on this practice.
It's a tragic situation, and it raises these really important questions about balancing economic needs with worker safety.
For sure. Now, let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
There's a lot of talk in these articles about how effective the PM Kisan scheme is, for supporting farmers,
Right.
especially those from marginalized communities. So are the benefits actually reaching those who need it the most?
Yeah, that's a really important question. The articles do present data on the people who are benefiting from the program, but there are still some concerns, about whether the scheme is truly inclusive and equitable.
And speaking of finances, the 14th Finance Commission recommended increasing the state's share of central tax revenue.
Oh, yeah. This has big implications for fiscal federalism. Essentially, it could give states more autonomy over their resources, but it also raises questions about accountability and the potential for disparity between different states.
Okay, enough about finances. Let's jump into the political arena.
All right.
Prime Minister Modi and Delhi Chief Minister Kejriwal are both facing some accusations of corruption and making false promises.
Yeah, it seems like the Congress leader is pretty vocal about his criticisms. And to add to that, you've got this debate about releasing Form 17C data from the Election Commission of India.
Yeah, it's like a transparency battle.
Exactly.
The public wants this data, but the ECI is pushing back.
Yeah, and all this is happening while the Delhi elections are coming up, and things are heating up with accusations of model code of conduct violations.
Right. The AAP is accusing a BJP leader of giving out goods and cash to influence voters.
Oh, wow.
And then to add even more political intrigue, there's that whole controversy over what to name the Navi Mumbai International Airport.
Oh, right.
The Shiv Sena is not happy with the delay in approving their proposal to name it after D.B. Patil. It's a reminder of how regional feelings and political maneuvering can clash. It's crazy how even naming an airport becomes a political thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. But let's shift gears again.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some pressing social issues. One that really stood out to me was this alarming rise in cancer cases in Meghalaya. Yeah, what's really concerning is that cultural and societal factors are preventing people from getting diagnosed and treated early.
Yeah, the articles mention superstitions and misconceptions about cancer as major barriers.
It's a good reminder that we need to address not just the medical aspects of a disease, but also the social and cultural context.
Absolutely. And on a brighter note, there's this new report, Engaging Men and Boys, a report on pathways to gender equality in India.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
It seems like there are some really cool initiatives focused on challenging traditional gender norms and getting men more involved in promoting equality.
Yeah, it's encouraging to see these efforts gaining traction. Getting men and boys involved is crucial to achieving true gender equality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not all good news.
Right.
There's some pretty worrying statistics about HIV/AIDS-related deaths in Tripura.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that this disease is still a major challenge, and there's still a lot of work to do in terms of prevention, awareness, and treatment.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with social, economic, and health implications. Let's zoom out a little bit and look at what's happening globally.
Okay.
One event that's dominating the headlines is Donald Trump's re-election as U.S. president.
I can only imagine the ripples this is going to cause across the world.
Right.
The articles are analyzing what kind of impact this will have on global politics, especially with his America First stance and his skepticism of these multilateral agreements.
It's definitely a major event that could reshape international relations in some pretty big ways.
Definitely. And speaking of international events with potential consequences, there's been a plane crash in Kazakhstan.
Mm-hmm.
And the circumstances are a bit suspicious.
Oh, really?
The articles point out that it can be really difficult to guarantee aviation safety in conflict zones, and there could be big legal ramifications if a state is found responsible.
It's something that definitely needs attention as more details come out, for sure.
Yeah. On a slightly more hopeful note, there's some cautious optimism about the talks between Israel and Hamas.
Oh.
It seems like they're getting closer to a ceasefire and the release of those hostages in Gaza.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, the sources are emphasizing how delicate the role of Arab and U.S. mediators is in these talks. And then closer to home, there's tension between India and Bangladesh over the border fencing.
Oh, right.
It seems Bangladesh is worried about the fencing while India says it's important for security. The articles really stress the need for dialogue and diplomacy to keep things from escalating. You know, it's a good reminder that countries need to communicate and find common ground, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like borders. Now, before we get into the economic headlines, I want to pause for a second and acknowledge all the human stories behind these events.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to get caught up in the facts and figures, but we can't forget the people who are actually affected by this. The families of those miners trapped in Meghalaya, the cancer patients who are struggling to get treatment, the people caught in the middle of conflict.
Their stories matter. And it's a reminder that behind every headline, there are real people whose lives are being changed by these events.
You make a really good point. It's about recognizing the human cost of these events and approaching things with empathy and compassion. But for now, let's shift our attention to the world of economy and business.
Okay.
One trend that's making investors a little nervous is rising bond yields globally.
Yeah, the sources explain that this could cause central banks to raise interest rates. And then that could impact government finances and make borrowing more expensive.
It's a complicated issue with a lot of potential consequences.
Yeah. And speaking of complex issues, the Indian direct-to-consumer market, the DTC market,
Right.
it's facing some challenges despite growing in recent years.
It's a classic David and Goliath situation, isn't it?
It is.
These new brands are trying to disrupt the market, but they're going up against these established giants like HUL, who have a lot of money and huge distribution networks.
Yeah, it's a fascinating battle to watch.
It is.
Will these DTC brands be able to carve out a place for themselves, or will they be swallowed up by the giants?
Only time will tell.
And speaking of giants, HCL Tech is celebrating some really good Q3 results. They've got strong growth and a positive outlook for the future.
Yeah, their focus on digital and AI seems to be paying off. But not every company in retail is doing so well. Avenue Supermarts, or D-Mart, as you know them, their stock prices have gone down lately.
Yeah.
The articles mention a few things that are causing this: rising competition, concerns about their profit margins, and a change in leadership that's coming up.
It's a reminder that even big successful companies aren't immune to market pressures and that the retail world is constantly changing. But let's end on a positive note. There's this inspiring story of Señores Pharma.
Oh, yeah.
It's an Indian pharmaceutical company that's making a splash.
Right.
Their IPO did really well, and they've got big plans to target the U.S. market for injectables.
Wow.
Their strategy is pretty unique. They're partnering with larger pharmaceutical companies,
That's interesting.
and it seems to be working for them.
Yeah, it just goes to show that innovation, strategic partnerships, and a bit of boldness can really take you far in business.
So what stands out to you from all these events and stories we've talked about so far? What's resonating with you?
Honestly, the whole idea of accountability just keeps coming up for me. You know, We saw it with that awful mining accident, the whole debate about the PM Keyzon scheme, and even those accusations against the politicians. It's like there's this real demand for transparency.
Right.
People want to see those in power being held responsible. And it feels especially strong today on January 14th, like it's a real turning point.
I totally agree. It's a common thread running through a lot of these stories.
Yeah.
And it's not just an Indian thing either. You know, that plane crash investigation
Yeah.
and the possible legal fallout? That highlights how international laws and norms are being challenged on a global level. It
Yeah.
really makes you think. It does. It makes you realize just how interconnected everything is. Like
Right.
something happens in Kazakhstan and it could affect aviation safety rules everywhere,
Exactly.
which could then affect travel in India.
Yeah.
It's all linked together.
Everything's connected.
And speaking of connections, I can't help but think about how much technology is shaping our lives,
Right.
the good and the bad.
It's a double-edged sword for sure.
It is.
On one hand, we have HCL Tech doing so well with all their digital and AI stuff,
Yeah.
which is really exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting.
But then there's the downside, the spread of all this misinformation on social media.
Right. It's like a constant struggle to figure out what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on like how much responsibility the individual has in all this? Like, how can we protect ourselves from falling for this misinformation?
It comes down to media literacy. We need to be more critical of the information we see. You know, question everything, check the sources, and be careful about anything that seems overly dramatic or tries to play on your emotions.
You're so right. It's so easy to get caught up in a catchy headline or a viral post. We need to take a step back and think critically about what we're reading and watching
Exactly.
and ask ourselves, is this real?
Right. Being a critical thinker also means being open to different perspectives, looking at things from different angles, looking for different sources of information, and being willing to challenge our own biases, you know?
Right. It's a good reminder that the truth is rarely simple. There's a lot of gray areas, and we need to be okay with that complexity.
Yeah.
But let's come back to India for a minute. That situation in Meghalaya
Right here.
with the rising cancer cases is really sad. What can we do to overcome those cultural barriers to treatment?
Well, it's going to take a multifaceted approach for sure.
Yeah.
We need to raise awareness about cancer, debunk those myths and misconceptions that keep people from getting diagnosed and treated early,
Right.
and make healthcare more accessible and more culturally sensitive.
Right.
It's about meeting people where they are and building that trust.
Absolutely. And it's about giving communities the knowledge to make informed decisions about their health. It reminds us that healthcare isn't just about medical treatment. It's about understanding those social and cultural factors too. But on a more positive note, that report about getting men and boys involved in gender equality really resonated with me. What do you think about the potential impact of these initiatives?
It's definitely a challenge. Changing deeply ingrained gender norms takes time and a lot of effort. But these programs are making a start. They're encouraging men to question traditional ideas of masculinity and become advocates for equality. It's a really powerful shift in perspective.
I love that. It's not just women fighting for their rights. It's about men recognizing their role in creating a fairer and more equal society.
Exactly. True equality needs everyone to work together, and that means men stepping up and being part of the solution. But let's go back to something we were discussing earlier, the financial side of that 14th Finance Commission recommendation. Could shifting the way revenue is allocated actually lead to better governance and development at the state level?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
On one hand, giving states more control over their money could empower them to tackle their specific needs and priorities.
Right.
But you also need strong institutions and responsible leadership at the state level to make sure that money is used well and transparently.
Yeah,
It's a test of India's federal structure.
it really is.
Can we balance centralized power with regional autonomy
Yeah.
and make things better for everyone?
It's something we'll have to keep an eye on.
Definitely. And while we're on the topic of challenges, the story of the D2C market and those new brands trying to compete with the big guys, it really highlights how dynamic the business world is. Do you think they stand a chance?
It's tough. They have to be really innovative and adaptable and build strong relationships with their customers. If they can set themselves apart and offer something truly unique, they might be able to carve out a space for themselves.
Right.
But it's definitely a David versus Goliath situation.
Yeah, it's a fight for survival in a market that's constantly changing. But speaking of fighting, that tension between India and Bangladesh over the border fence is a bit worrying. Do you think they'll be able to work it out through diplomacy?
Hopefully. It seems like they both understand the importance of talking to each other and finding a peaceful solution.
Yeah,
It'll take some careful negotiation and commitment to finding common ground, but I think there's reason to be hopeful.
I hope so. It's a good reminder that even in today's world where everything feels so connected
Yeah.
and global issues are always in the news, regional relationships, and those personal connections between countries that are close to each other are still super important.
You're absolutely right. It's about finding that balance between engaging with the rest of the world and nurturing those close to home relationships. But let's switch gears for a second. We've covered a lot today, from politics and the economy to social issues and international events.
Mm.
What's one question or idea that you think our listeners should think about as they go about their day? What's that one takeaway you'd like them to consider?
After hearing about Trump getting reelected and his whole America First thing, it makes you wonder what's going to happen to global cooperation, you know,
Right.
especially today, January 14th, with
Yeah.
everything else going on. Can countries still work together on the big problems like climate change or, another pandemic when everyone's so focused on themselves?
Yeah, that's a huge question. It's a test for the whole world. Can we put our own interests aside and find common ground for the sake of the planet and everyone on it?
It really makes you think about those agreements and organizations that are supposed to bring everyone together.
Right.
Are they strong enough to deal with all this?
Yeah.
But let's bring it back to something a little closer to home. We talked about those challenges the D2C market in India is facing.
Yeah.
Do you think those new brands actually have a chance against the big companies?
It's a tough fight. Like we said, it's David versus Goliath. But I do think there's some reason to be hopeful. If these D2C brands can really innovate and connect with their customers on a deeper level and offer something truly different, then they might be able to make a space for themselves.
So it's not enough to just have a good product.
Right.
It's about building a brand that people really connect with.
Exactly. It's about building trust and loyalty. And we can't forget about being flexible and adaptable.
Right.
In today's world, things change so fast, and those qualities are crucial if you want to survive,
Yeah.
especially for those smaller companies trying to make a name for themselves. But going back to that story about misinformation online,
Yeah.
it's a bit scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
With so much information flying around, how can we tell what's real and what's not?
It's like we have to be detectives all the time.
Right.
Questioning everything, checking sources, comparing different pieces of information. It's exhausting.
It is, but it's so important these days. It's about having a healthy level of skepticism without being completely cynical. It's about understanding that everyone has their own point of view, and it's our job to sift through that and try to find the truth.
And sometimes the truth is complicated. There's not always a simple answer.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to Meghalaya and the rising cancer rates and the cultural challenges to getting treatment. What can we actually do to address this problem?
It's going to take a multi-pronged approach, for sure.
Yeah.
We need to educate people about cancer and dispel those myths and misconceptions that keep them from seeking help. And we need to make healthcare more accessible, both physically and culturally. It's about closing that gap between traditional beliefs and modern medicine.
So it's about understanding people's concerns and making healthcare more inclusive and sensitive to their culture.
Right.
But let's end on a hopeful note. The Story Señoras the Indian pharmaceutical company that's making such progress with their IPO and their plans to expand to the U.S. market, is really inspiring.
It is. It's a great example of what innovation, strategic thinking, and determination can do. They saw an opportunity and they went for it, even when it wasn't easy. It reminds us that even when things are tough, you can still succeed.
It shows that there are people out there, both individuals and companies, who are working to make a positive difference in the world. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the news from January 14th, 2025, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think it's this. The world is a complex place full of challenges and possibilities. Stay informed, stay curious, and don't shy away from the tough questions. Because in the end, it's up to all of us to create the future we want.
Well said. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. Keep exploring these topics. Dig a little deeper, challenge your own ideas, and never stop learning.
Knowledge is power as long as we use it wisely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time.